Welcome back to Climate Change Challenges and Solutions. It's week 6 and we've been looking at the impacts of climate change on human societies, especially the built environment, and the challenges of ensuring food security in the future. I'm delighted to be joined by Tristan Kershaw to help us answer some of the questions on buildings and the built environment, and we'll also go over a whole range of your questions about this week's topics. So guys, where should we start?
So a few people wondering about the statistics you showed in your video, Tristan, about the 30% and 50% related to the carbon emissions from buildings and how that splits up.
Well, it gets a bit complicated really, because different countries build their buildings in different ways, from sort of highly renewable materials in places like Africa and Asia to obviously more concrete and stone based in Europe. If we take the UK figure, the 56% of carbon emissions, that does include construction of buildings. But if we look at energy use or carbon emissions, because they're equivalent, in the UK and ignore transport, over half of that in use is just heating the air and heating water in buildings.
Wow.
And about another 20% is lighting. So the built environment is a major cause of carbon emissions in developed countries.
I suppose when you think about it, it is where we use most of our energy.
Precisely.
Inside buildings, yeah.
There's 22 million homes in the UK, for example. So it's a large source of carbon emissions.
Okay.
We're also wondering about the differences between ground level and the top of these buildings, and why at night and why at the very highest of these high-rise buildings it becomes really exacerbated, this heat island effect and heat stroke.
Well, the heat island effect isn't necessarily exacerbated on the higher levels.
Okay.
It's more the fact that they are the top of the building, so heat has risen through the building structure. But also, a lot of these high-rise buildings have flat roofs, and a lot of heat comes from the sun through a flat roof. So if you go up a tower block, often the upper floors are a lot hotter than the lower floors because they have less shading and they've got that extra solar gain coming through the building fabric just because of that angle to the sun.
Wow, we might be having our bedrooms downstairs in future then.
Well, yes, we might start digging underground perhaps.
Yeah, great.
We'll see what happens. Watch that space.
So are there ways that we're starting to think about adapting our built environment to the challenges we face in the future?
Well, I think it's an area of ongoing research, something I'm particularly interested in myself. Architecture has kind of evolved over the last few thousand years in different countries, and obviously they have very different climates, some of these areas. So it's interesting to look how they have adapted what was originally, say, British architecture, because we colonised a lot of countries, how that's evolved in the last few hundred years to be better suited to that climate. And there's small but subtle differences. So hopefully there's a lot we can learn and potentially adapt our current building stock.
Great. And are people asking about the broader trends of people moving towards cities and the like?
Yeah, a little. I know a lot of our population, as countries industrialise, populations tend to concentrate in cities, so we're looking at this becoming more and more of a problem, I suppose.
Yeah, over half of the 7 billion people on the planet now are in urban areas, and I've heard projections that that's going to approach 70% of people by the middle of this century. So we're going to have a whole raft of new cities. Could
Yes.
are we going to see sort of many Singapores of the future, as it were, these very high-tech design city environments in what would otherwise be a very hot place even in a normal climate?
Potentially, yes. I mean, the mega cities that are being built in Asia at the minute, they tend to be effectively playing with urban layout to try and reduce the urban heat island in maybe a haphazard way.
Yeah.
But that kind of experimentation is something they can do, and we can't, because our cities are already built. So
Yeah.
we can take their findings and try and implement them here. But
And
generally, they include more green and blue space to try and, so that's plants and water.
Right.
So
And
that
that's-
evaporation of water from the urban area has a cooling effect, and that helps reduce the urban heat island.
That's a nice idea, as long as we're not in a world with a shortage of water in the future, I guess, or that we make sure it's what do you call it, grey water when it's
Wastewater. Yeah.
kind of
Grey water, rainwater,
yeah.
potentially black water.
Do you think the cities of the future are going to have to be doing a lot of relying on water recycling and reprocessing upstream? If I remember rightly, London already, the Londoners are often drinking water
One of
that's
the
been
most
through
water scarce areas of the UK.
through many cycles of processing upstream.
Mm.
That's it.
Yeah. I think you will find that more.
Mm.
There's, for the Olympic Park in London, they implemented black water reuse. So
Right.
water was treated on site from toilet flushing and wash basins and then treated to non-drinking standard but suitable for reflushing of toilets.
Mm.
So that was kind of a closed loop, if you like, not
Great.
influencing the water supplies of the region.
But the big challenge there is presumably the infrastructure to have two sets of pipes in the building or whatever.
It's suitable for large-scale developments such as,
Yeah.
say, an Olympic Park, but it could be implemented in the future into urban areas as more of a retrofit solution, I suppose.
Cool.
So we were interested in this kind of closing of loops and recycling systems in general as populations grow. And population's really been kind of the elephant in the room this week, I think, as we've been talking about built urban environments and our food supply as well. Both of these things are kind of driven by a globally growing population, and a lot of people have wondered why we haven't sort of tackled that issue head on.
All right. Let's step into the breach then and copy. What's he called? Hans
Rosling.
Hans Rosling as nice way of illustrating this. So first of all, we need to get our head around the idea that there's a certain inevitability in getting from 7 billion people today to 9 billion people at least. So we've got in the 0 to 15 years old age group about 2 billion people. 15 to 30, another 2 billion. Let's get this right. Next one's going to be 30 to 45. We've got just one in there, is that right? 45 to 60, there's about one in there. And 60 plus, about 1 billion people. Now, so what we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Good, it adds up. Imagine the breeding people. Okay, I may have done some breeding in the interval of 30 to 45, but most of them are down here. Imagine we're just at replacement rate. Every couple has, on average, 2 children. What's going to happen as we move into the future? Well, these are all the people alive today. They're all going to get steadily older. So the people who are 15 to 30 now will go into this bracket here and add 1 billion there, and we'll just replace another new 2 billion down the bottom. Then they'll get older again. We get another billion up here. And then we can debate whether, because of extensions of lifespan, we might get another 500 million or so up here. But that's how it's almost inevitable we're going to get to at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 billion, and probably more like 9.5, just by simply the people who are alive today having, on average 2 kids a couple and just steadily getting older. So for me, that's the backdrop. We can't do much about that. Yeah, we need to get education and birth control options to women in the developing world, all over the world, to help keep the issue of new blocks heading on the bottom under control and give everybody a better quality of life. But still, we're going to have to manage this transition, which we expect by 2050-ish. We've got these 9 billion people. Now, that's one side of the famous equation of sort of total impact on the planet, right? But the other factor is multiplying the population over here by the per capita consumption, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, that sort of per capita waste or consumption. Now, and then we get the sort of total environmental impact. Now, the thing is, consumption is kind of a function of how rich we are, right? And as well as this going from 7 to 9 point something billion, the projections are saying, we heard earlier that, well, maybe half of us live in cities now, 70% in the future, and everyone's supposed to get richer. So that what's classed as a middle class income today is enjoyed by only 1 billion of the 7, but is projected to be 4 billion of the 9 or whatever in 2050. Now, if that means that we keep current patterns of consumption, basically rich people create a disproportionate amount of the waste products like carbon dioxide that are causing climate change, then we have got a monumental problem on our hands. So we can't do much about this, as I tried to explain, the population part of the equation. We've really got to get to work on the per capita consumption and associated wastes and emissions, because otherwise we're going to run out of planets.
This is a classic problem in the food security conversation as well, because we know that as people get richer, their diet changes and they tend to eat more food and more energy and resource intensive kinds of food. So people eat more meat and more sort of high energy grains than they would if they were poorer.
Yeah, like a double whammy, because I know you researched this yourself, Tom. The disproportionate effect of choosing to get 500 of your calories or whatever through meat rather than through vegetable products, because you've had to feed that meat with vegetable products, and only about 10% of the energy in the vegetable products has managed to make it at best into the meat you
Which
eat.
gives you a sort of 10 times greater footprint of resources, if you like, or footprint of energy,
So that's leading us into the other topic of this week, really, which is this issue of food security and the challenge of feeding people. Do we have some particular questions emerging on that?
Well, permaculture was a word which got bandied around on the comments quite a lot, but maybe it would be nice to give a description of what permaculture actually is. And
I believe that's a great question. I mean, I'm quite a fan of the whole principles of permaculture. I believe the word permaculture came from kind of compressing the words permanent and agriculture, but it's very much a way of thinking about producing food that's based on the principles of thinking about a system, a whole system, a kind of food production ecosystem in this case. And the idea, just like the planet has been a fantastic self-regulating system for the climate, etc., the idea is that the best or the most long-term sustainable food production systems need to take this kind of mentality and think of themselves as mini ecosystems, where to get effective food production you want to marry pollinators with the things they pollinate and give the pollinators a good environment, give all the natural pest control options a good place to live, and also have this thing that might be called zone zero in permaculture, which is you should always have some land set aside for just wild nature to do its thing. And if we think at a truly planetary scale, absolutely that's what we need to do. We've got to avoid, we can't get into a situation where we chop down all of the ecosystems on the land surface and leave no natural ecosystems, because those natural ecosystems, as we've been learning in the course, are absolutely crucial for regulating the climate. So we need a lot of zone zero at a planetary scale, and we also have to feed ourselves. In fact, we have to feed more of ourselves, the 9 point something billion. So that's a deep challenge, I think. And we could talk a bit more about that, especially if people are curious.
I think the diversity and the cycling nature of permaculture farming systems are also something people like to talk about in the context of climate change and extreme weather, because there's an idea that diversity is associated with resilience and ability to kind of withstand external pressures and environmental pressures, maybe.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I noticed on the forums people starting to ask about, obviously there's a challenge here. We've got to feed 9 point something billion people. Can we do that in a changing climate? Are we going to have to put more land under the plough, etc.? the only way to avoid putting more land under the plough is to intensify on the agricultural land we have. Oh, and yes, reduce the wastes in the food system between the farm gate and the consumer. That would help a great deal. But yeah, there's this bigger challenge then of, well, is it going to get easier or harder to make that food in this changing world, changing climate? So I noticed some people have sort of noted that, as we talked about earlier, as the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere goes up, photosynthesis gets more efficient. That's good news.
Carbon dioxide fertilisation,
Yeah. Yeah, so that's good news, and obviously crops are plants, so they're going to benefit from that. But the general pattern of the world getting warmer is not great news. It might be good for food production in the colder bits of the world, but in the global picture it's probably overall bad. And then we have some other pollutants, like there's this stuff, ground level ozone, the low level tropospheric ozone that we talked about in one of the earlier feedback videos, distinguishing it from the ozone in the ozone layer. That stuff is bad for our health. And actually it's bad for plants, it damages plants, and it's been building up. It's a kind of a byproduct of partly a byproduct of methane emissions and also other pollution from like motor vehicles. So that's hammering food production. And then Tom, you've just made a great point about extremes. I mean, we've just gone through a roller coaster winter of extreme rainfall here, which has flooded many farmlands in the UK. We are seeing a world trend in a changing climate towards more climate extremes, be they on the wet side or sometimes, like in Australia of late, on the hot side. And it's not so much the mean change in the climate that crops are worrying about, but rather the extremes that can hammer the crop and take it out potentially before it's harvested, and that, or seriously deplete it. That's a crucial effect.
Yeah. I think there's another really important point that's often overlooked when people bring up carbon dioxide fertilisation, is that a lot of the experiments that are done on plants in labs and even in open fields,
Right.
those FACE experiments, they kind of just bump the CO2 concentration straight up from ambient to about 1,000 ppm, which is like twice as much as we're expecting in the next century. And you see a very different response in plants when you do that from if you sort of gradually ramp it up, when actually the fertilisation effect is often offset by other things like limiting nitrate uptake through the roots. You don't tend to see such a strong effect.
Absolutely. So Sarah talked a bit about these challenges and this really other interesting idea that the potential pathogens, the things that are going to damage the crop, they're responding to a warming world as well, and that her group have got this fantastic evidence now that those crop pathogens, just like everything else, is moving with warming, they're moving towards the poles, and they're making contact with croplands that previously might have not had to face them.
Yeah.
So we've got a massive challenge to the agricultural scientists and the farmers of the planet. What are people worried about that? Are they thinking, this sounds like intensive agriculture?
Dichotomy between doing intensive agriculture and creating GM crops to try and offset these pathogens and improve the resilience and these type of things, and then versus this whole shake-up of the agricultural system and doing things like permaculture and local growing and these kind of systems.
Well, I've thought hard about that, and I know Tom has. And in a world of, if we was just one block here, if there's 1 billion of us, I think we'd fantastic. We'd have the luxury to say, we want to go permaculture, no GM, minimise intensive agriculture. We'd have enough planet to do that with. Already, Tom, you'll remind me, but already with 7 billion people, we manage a little bit, is it 5.5 billion hectares of the world's surface, and the total productive surface of the land, if you exclude the ice sheets and the deserts, is around the 10 billion hectares-ish. So you're talking about farming has already got hold of over half of the productive land surface of the earth.
It's about a quarter of the vegetation on the Earth's surface as well, if you want to think of it like that.
So there it is, a quarter of the world's vegetation is being farmed in agriculture. Now remember this stuff, remember first of all, we got another 2.5 billion people by 2050, and then what Tom mentioned earlier, everyone on average, it was seen, wants to eat more meat, and that puts a really, we say, non-linear demand on food production. So that instead of food production just going up proportional with the 2.5 billion people, instead the demand is going up. It's effectively doubling, and possibly doubling even by 2030. It's only 17 years away. And we've already said we're farming more than half of the productive land surface of the planet, and our demand for food is about to double in a very short space of time. What are we going to do? We can't just be as efficient as we are now and try and double the area that we farm on. We'll run out of area. We'll screw all of the remaining terrestrial ecosystems. We can't do that because they're crucial to the carbon cycle and the functioning of the climate system. For me, there's no way out. There's no way out. We have to do more intensive, efficient, if you like, production on the land that's already being farmed. We have to absolutely eliminate waste in the food chain between the farm gate, if you like, and the consumer. And if we're going to eat more meat, well, Tom knows all about this. We have to eat it we have to pick the most efficient forms. We're probably going to have to develop aquaculture, so basically getting meat protein from the ocean and
we like these kind of systems that give us meat for a lower footprint of resources, so things that recycle our wastes. Systems where you can feed food waste to pigs or to fish in aquaculture systems give us a much cheaper way of producing meat, if you like, in terms of resources.
And right now we're pretty wasteful we load nutrients onto the land to try and maintain high yields, and we're going to have to, as we've said, maintain high yields in the future and actually increase them. I think we could be a lot smarter. We could be a lot more efficient with our nutrient utilization by the crops. And ironically, we've had a history of breeding out the natural nutrient suppliers to the crop, the nitrogen fixing bacteria, if you like, that live in little nodules in natural plants in their roots. They've been bred out, and now bioscientists, agricultural scientists, some of them are trying to breed that partnership or symbiosis back in, so that we don't have to load as much industrially manufactured nitrogen back on the land. Now that may bring us into this discussion or territory of genetic modification, which I know is a really emotive topic, and it is a little ironic that we've sort of bred out some very useful natural strains and properties of crops, and if we ironically had to genetically engineer those partnerships back in, that would be ironic. But if it's what's required to feed 9-point-something billion without losing all of the rest of the natural ecosystems, I have to say I would rather preserve those natural ecosystems and consider, much as I don't think it's ideal, I'd rather preserve those natural ecosystems and consider what are hopefully very carefully regulated ways of genetically modifying positive things for food production, which is a difficult conclusion to have to come to, and I'm sure some people on the course won't be happy to hear that. But it's now you're looking at these kind of ethical, moral scales and weighing up extraordinary things, and I just can't. I want a future we keep the remaining natural ecosystems of the planet intact, and therefore we've got to do super smart agriculture.
I think it's a really interesting point where a real mixture of kind of high-tech and low-tech solutions can work together to give us kind of much more sustainable systems. So we know already that if we have much less chemical input to soils, we get better nutrient cycling and better resistance to pesticides because we have a more healthy microbiology in the soil. And that kind of knowledge is taking us right back to these kind of permaculture ideas, which are very low-tech, very natural, ecological ways of managing land. And if we can combine them with some high-tech ways of developing crops and developing technologies, that can give us potentially a really healthy, productive system.
That's a great point, Tom. we're definitely in favour of, say, mulching to try and recover the richness of the soil, the organic carbon content of the soil, to counteract what's been a long-term trend of erosion of soils, which depletes the kind of essential base for food production. So yeah, I think I would advocate we do all of those nice, simple, low-tech things first. And let's in a way hope we don't have to start meddling with nature in the GM sense. But when we have to be very clear there, we have been implicitly genetically modifying crops ever since we started to domesticate them. I mean, we didn't do it in a high-tech way, but we artificially select both crops and animals for farming for now well over 10,000 years, and that's been a profound genetic modification of those organisms simply by imposing a strong artificial selection. If we now talk about, with the technology we have, as we said, perhaps doing further modification, if it's perhaps to go back to some of these ideas like having natural nitrogen fixing partnership, the irony is we're actually using the high-tech GM actually to go back to something positive that we started with. So I hope that might make some of the viewers slightly more comfortable.
Just to raise a point on that, in terms of the biology of it all, genetic modification is also going on all the time. It's also a natural process. There's this thing called horizontal gene transfer.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of human genome which is virus made, and some of those viral proteins actually are essential for what we do as humans now.
And I think that's what's tricky for us as scientists in a discussion with the publics at large. We know this stuff and it's very familiar to us, but we're probably failing in education. Hopefully this course is helping remedy it, just understanding these things.
Yeah.
So if we think about this, sorry Tom.
Well, I was just going to say, you mentioned sort of this level of consumption of meat and food waste, so there's a huge amount of personal choice in the system as well.
Yeah.
And you pointed out that 5.5 billion hectares of land are used to produce food now. About 4 billion hectares of that is used to produce livestock products. So if we, which is a staggering amount. So a real thought for ourselves about what we're consuming and also how we use food and how we waste food, which takes us back slightly to kind of Tristan's urban world, I think, because this industrial system of food production that we have now goes hand in hand with technologies like mass refrigeration, which allow us to bring all the food into the urban environment. And there's a very close relationship between the way that food is grown and the way it's distributed in cities and the way that it's used in cities.
And the way it's stored as well.
And the way it's stored, exactly, yeah.
That's a fantastic point. So those viewers, listeners who are uncomfortable with fancy, interfering with technologies like genetic modification, remember this side of the equation. Remember that the meat consumption is this huge driver on demand for land use. If you don't want a GM future, or one where we chop down a load of natural ecosystems to make food, then we have to look at the demand side and make some changes in our own diets, enjoy eating a bit less meat, being healthier, and thus avoid these technologies that we may not want to use. And I love the link to the cities, this urbanised future world. It makes me want to ask you, Tristan, about people who speculate about growing food in the cities even. There's people, I've seen the designs for kind of aquaponics in skyscrapers. Do you think that's still science fiction, or?
No, I don't think it is. I think the reality is that we are unlikely to knock down the buildings we already have.
Right.
And so we're more of a situation of trying to adapt the ones we've already got. I think the Mayor of London is quite keen on roof gardens, for instance, for people that have got flat roofs, or incorporating green roofs, for instance, turf or sedum on.
Yeah.
Not only does that help against an open heat island, but it gives you potential to grow your own food as well. And
it's very much on the permaculture principle: maximise what you can do in the area or the space you have. Even if you just have a window box, you can still grow something.
There's some really nice ideas popping up in cities now, like a project I'm involved with here in Exeter called Exeter Urban Farm, where we collect tea and coffee grounds and use them to grow mushrooms in the city, and that's something that doesn't need a huge amount of space, but apparently we get through something like 70 million tea bags a day in the UK, and if we can turn that into a real food source, I think that's a wonderful idea.
That's a nice note to end on as you clutch your mug of tea. That we've all been contributing to Tom's mushroom growing enterprise by donating old tea bags. Thanks for a great discussion, guys. Now, next week we're going to move on to the topic of human responses to climate change, especially when we think about trying to mitigate our emissions of carbon dioxide. Is that a value-free choice? How do people respond to this? And Tristan will be rejoining us. We'll be looking at this big picture of mitigation and adaptation of climate change, and also my colleague Patrick Devine-Wright, a fellow hill runner, is going to be talking about these difficult social dilemmas as we enter into this changing climate of the future. So see you then.